the difficulty of something like a message like today is the fact that if you were going to open up the prophecy of Haggai and read about the shaking of the earth and what that means, I'll give you an example of something, because you can pretty much find it in a diversity of ways. I just finished going through the book of Amos. I was reading there, but it's all over the map here. In Joel, you read how it says, the earth shall quake before them, the heavens shall tremble, the sun and the moon shall be dark, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. The Lord shall utter his voice before his army, for his camp is very great. He is strong that executeth his word. For the day of the Lord is great and very terrible. Who can abide in it? People will do all kinds of crazy things with the shaking of the earth. That's future time. And you can kind of get an idea that if you were going to go back to, say, the book of Zechariah, you can even catch it there in Zechariah 14. In fact, there's so many things to talk about. Sometimes my frustration is I'll take as much as I can of the information in, and trying to sift it down to one thing is difficult, because it bifurcates. There's two roads here, and then off of those two roads are another two roads, and it just keeps branching out. When we get into the prophecy teaching, which I intend to start doing, I pray in the new year, I think you'll be really surprised to see there are, we'll call it woven in to almost every prophet, in terms of course, all prophecy is given, but there's a certain pattern woven in. You can, once you start lining up who preached in which time and where the prophecies are going to, and some of the things that are being said, then you come back to these, we'll call them foundational messages, where it seems like I've emptied the garbage pail out, and a lot of other things will make sense. So for some people who don't understand about the signet or the shaking of the earth, we'll eventually get to that, because the picture is all lined up, obviously, ultimately, to lead us to future time for Christ coming, his second coming. But there's just so much. It's like, where do you begin? So of course I sat down and I made a couple of charts this week. No, not just the one you saw, but got very inspired, and I lined up all the kings, and I in the middle put all the prophets, and tried to make some lines and put all the arrows out. It looked like a crazy map, to kind of give an idea for people. And I need to hone this better, but for people who are trying to put it all together, it can be a challenge if you're trying to figure out, well, when did this guy speak over here? When did that happen? And we tend to think, oh, well, everybody knows that. But you'd be surprised at how many people don't know what the timeline is. So, for example, when we talk about Isaiah, and I mentioned the prophecies referring to Cyrus in Isaiah 44 and 45, and it would be easy to say that when we say years before Cyrus was born, this prophecy was uttered. And if you kind of understand what happens with Israel and Judah and the cutting off, the leading away of Israel by the Assyrians, there's 136 years difference between Israel and Judah, between the Assyrian and the Babylonian captivity. And everything that happens in between that time, people think, well, how can we know? Well, between what's recorded in Kings and Chronicles, and then, of course, you've got the different prophecies. When you put that all together, it makes this incredible whole picture. So for those of you who are going, oh, don't worry, we'll get to it, because that's my specialty, is I like to make charts and maps. All right, so pray for the trees. What do I want to read to you? I want to read something to you. Just something very simple. Something very simple that is out of Jeremiah. Jeremiah 25, where Jeremiah is going to talk about the 70 years. And something so simple. I'm speaking about what he said, but I'm also speaking about chronology. And this is some of the ways that you can count what's going on where. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. And if you ever get confused, just remember Kim, K-I-M, even though the Hebrew is not K, K-I-M, versus Jehoiakim, N, which is after, M first, N after. The son of Josiah, king of Judah, that was the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So, we know that Josiah, we can know the reign of Josiah, when we can count where about this prophecy is occurring. He spells it out here, the 13th year of Josiah, the son of Amon, king of Judah, even unto this day. And we know that where his reign started, we can count and calculate 23 years to the time where, in approximation, the time is approximately 604 or 605, just in this area right here. Why? Because you can also measure the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So you can measure all these things out. And if you know the teaching on even out of Daniel, that whole prophecy and what is described of the image, that gives you some great timelines right there. They're just nicely woven in there. So you can get the timeline of Nebuchadnezzar. You can see what time Jeremiah is speaking. From the 13th year of Josiah, the son of Amon, king of Judah, even unto this day, that is the 23rd year, the word of the Lord hath come unto me, and I have spoken unto you, rising early and speaking, but you have not hearkened. And the Lord hath sent unto you all his servants, the prophets, rising early and sending them, but ye have not hearkened, nor inclined your ear to hear. They said, Turn ye again now every one from his evil way, and from the evil of your doings that dwell in the land that the Lord hath given unto you and to your father forever and ever. Now, we read this, and it's kind of like what I've said. It's words on paper. Turn. Prophets came, said, turn, repent, turn back. But when you read this, and when I read this, it should speak to us that God is still calling people to do the same thing, and people will still respond the same way, which is, why should I listen? Why should I bother? Now, we're not going to be carried away like these people. We know for those people who will turn, God has obviously given the ability for them to turn, to listen, to hear. But it's the same principle. It's frustrating to me how we can read something like this and we can say, why didn't they listen? But then here's God's plan unfolding. It says here, verse 6, And go not after other gods to serve them and to worship them, and provoke me not to anger with the works of your hands, and I will do you no hurt. But ye have not hearkened unto me, saith the Lord, that ye might provoke me to anger with the works of your hands to your own hurt. Therefore thus saith the Lord of hosts, because ye have not heard my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, saith the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. You notice that, my servant. You'll find that that is also used of Zerubbabel. When God is going to use for his purpose, he'll say, my servant, even King Nebuchadnezzar, to accomplish his purpose. My servant, and will bring them against this land, and against the inhabitants thereof, and against all these nations round about, will utterly destroy them, and make them an astonishment, and a hissing, and a perpetual desolations. Moreover, I will take from them the voice of mirth, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, the sound of the millstones, and the light of the candle. And you wonder why, when we read what Paul was writing in Romans 9, talking about the wild olive branches. It's remarkable. All of these things God is saying here to these people that will be carried away for 70 years, and then turn it around. Here's later in the New Testament, Paul will be talking again to a Gentile crowd, speaking and addressing Israel in Romans 9. it's remarkable that no matter where you go, God is saying the same thing. He uses different mouthpieces, but he's saying the same thing. The whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment. And these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Not 60-some, not 70-some, 70 years. And it shall come to pass when the 70 years are accomplished that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, saith the Lord, for their iniquity. In the land of the Chaldeans, and I will make it a perpetual desolations. I will bring upon that land all my words which I have pronounced against it, even all that is written in this book which Jeremiah hath prophesied against all the nations. For many nations and great kings shall serve themselves of them. Also I will recompense them according to their deeds and according to the works of their own hands. Now, you take this passage and Jeremiah 29, just go a few chapters later, in Jeremiah 29 and verse 10, where it says that after the 70 years be accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you, perform my good word toward you, and causing you to return to this place. And some people will say, well, this is just a random circumstance. I will cause you to return to this place. Now, what is it? The end of Chronicles talks about the decree of Cyrus. The opening of Ezra reinforces that decree of Cyrus. And in, I believe it's Ezra 6, they rediscover that edict of Cyrus, and it's reread because now people are coming back and saying, well, this should not be happening this way. The enemy is the ones who are provoking. All because God said he would cause the people to return to this place. Not random. But I want you to think about something. All the people we know who were carried away into captivity, and those who responded to make the journey. Maybe 4, possibly 5 months journey from where they were, uprooting themselves, in many cases, including Zerubbabel, not having known anything else except Babylon. Now, we tend to think of the people who were carried away, but what about the people who were born? Zerubbabel, born in Babylon. And this is why I said, think of these things. Had Zerubbabel ever seen? Maybe he heard of, maybe someone told him, but had he ever seen the temple while it stood in all of its splendor? No. And what about the altar? We could just keep going down the line of how incredible that God would send somebody. This is why I fully reject when people say, well, what's the qualification for ministry? The qualification is that God sends somebody, that God picks somebody up and sends them. That's the criteria. The criteria begins with that burden that God has sent you. You know, God sometimes has a strange sense of humor, speaking as the voice of experience, but recognizing even a man like Zerubbabel. He didn't have ministry experience, and yet God gave him the wisdom and the understanding. He gave him the knowledge somehow, gave him the people around him to accomplish it. So these passages are, to me, quite profound. You read in the opening of Daniel. In Daniel, he says he understood. He understood by books the number of years whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolation of Jerusalem. And then he sets his face to pray and to intercede, and is praying as though he, all the people, but speaking as the spokesperson, all taking the blame, essentially, and petitioning God, an incredible prayer on the part of Daniel after he reads about and understood about the prophecy of Jeremiah. Now, I think there's people here who have listened to Dr. Scott teach, and his teaching is brilliant. It weaves an incredible picture. I want you to think that there's more layers to peel back in some of the smaller passages that haven't gotten that much attention, like what we looked at today, and we'll need to revisit the genealogy again, because I think that could be well overlooked. Somebody asked me and said, well, how do you get to this genealogy, the genealogical understanding? Take all the pieces together, put them all together, and here you have Zerubbabel at the crossroads of both, in fact, we'll call it the royal line and the priestly line, meeting right there in the picture that, or in the chart that I showed. And the interesting thing is that we know this is important. Why? Because Hebrews tells us about Jesus, our high priest. You know, you start looking at it, you see God is just, keep digging long enough, you're going to see God has been saying the same thing. He's just been saying it in different ways from different mouths to say, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? That should produce something. That should produce eyes that are wide as saucers and ears that are, wow, like Dumbo. You got me, I'm listening. Not to tantalize and to, let's go into the unknown, but to build up faith, to inspire you to lean on God a little bit more when the circumstance hits. These people are an exact record of God's faithfulness. Then I suggest that you and I start looking at this and saying, I'm going to take a fresh look. I'm going to reread these passages. We'll revisit this. Not done. We just got started. And in terms of Nehemiah, I don't think, I've abandoned Nehemiah, because the 7th chapter, believe it or not, this message that I delivered to you today, my poor Bible's just looking fine here. How could one word, just one word, inspire a whole message? Take a look at that purple right there. I saw that name and I said, I got to go check it out. Yeah, okay, so you're saying, wow, can you read that? You still read that Bible? Yeah. And this is the new one I told you. Bible killer. We actually have a new term. When you stay in the Word long enough, you can have Bible burnout. Sorry. All right. We'll come back to this. I do want some of you who don't have the background, who don't have the foundation, to not get discouraged and think, well, I can't keep up because I don't know enough of this. Well, even if you've heard the teaching, this is a great way to kind of reconnect the dots and maybe open up some other vistas that you hadn't considered before. Hopefully, the end result is still the same. It'll give you more faith. It'll increase your faith. Now, I need reservations and your commitments. Get on the telephone. I don't think it's an accident. We can go to some other details here. I don't think it's an accident that the restored altar in Ezra, and it says, in the day they restored the altar was the 7th month. I don't think it's an accident that the restoration of the altar, the offering of the sacrifices, and the feast coinciding with the Feast of Tabernacles. And interestingly enough, if you're reading the record of Ezra, the Day of Atonement is missing. We'll talk about that later. But I don't think it's an accident that event happens at that time, which is another picture of a future time, a future regathering and reunification of Israel at a future time, which is recorded in Zechariah. In other words, again, things that repeat themselves. Now, let's talk about something else for a minute. We know about the decree of Cyrus. Let's talk about something else for a second here. The discrepancy, as I mentioned, between Chronicles and Kings regarding the age of Jehoiakim, who is also Jeconiah, who is also Coniah. Get it straight. Sorry. 2 Kings 24 It says, Jeconiah was 18 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. That's it. Pretty good king. He only lasts 3 months. Although Zedekiah reigned for 11 years. He was a really interesting person. 3 months. What do you do in 3 months as king? Now, this is why I said to you, I don't believe he was 8 years old, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Because the record in Chronicles says, 2 Chronicles 36:2 says, Jehoiakim was 8 years old when he began to reigned 3 months and 10 days. Well, that sounds pretty precise, except for the fact that if you're reading back in 2 Kings 24, and he carried away Jehoiakim to Babylon, and the king's mother and the king's wives. It's a busy 8-year-old. Got to just hold that thought for a minute. Just trying to stay in the word here is difficult. All right. It says, these interesting details. His mother's name was Nehushta. Where do you think she got that name from? Nehushta. Sounds kind of like if you add an N, Nehushtan. Anyway, Nehushta, the female version, I don't know. The daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem. So you have the background there. And it's these small details of family tree. What's important is that Jehoiakim, it seems as though his mother may have been a commingled situation. And people talk about why are the genealogies important? Well, ultimately to lead us to Christ and to maintain that pure line. But there's all kinds of interesting things that you can read here. Now, in another record, you read here 2 Kings 24, after it says they carried away the king's mother, the king's wives, his officers, and the mighty of the land, those carried he into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. All the men of might, even 7,000, and craftsmen and smiths 1,000 that were strong and apt for war, even them the king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon. And the king of Babylon made Mattaniah, his father's brother, king in his stead, and changed his name to Zedekiah. This is all the stuff that people can get terribly confused about. Because in the genealogies, of 1 Chronicles 3, it says, and the sons of Jehoiakim, Jeconiah his son, and Zedekiah his son. But it's his uncle. That you know from what I just read for you, just out of the other passage. So Mattaniah is the uncle who becomes, his name is changed to Zedekiah. And while we're on the subject of confusion, I'm looking at the same, and the sons of Jeconiah, Asir, Salathiel or Shealtiel, Malkarim, Pedaiah, and so forth. Now, somebody might ask, how did this all happen? And who is Neri, right? Now, if you line up everything in the genealogies, you will be forced to look at this and recognize Pedaiah here as the only mention and the reason for it and all of that. There's something so significant in all of these details, but don't get confused. And people say, well, which is it, Shealtiel or is it Pedaiah? It's both. Well, how can it be both? Well, by law, by the Levirate or in Deuteronomy, the law says if somebody dies, let's say husband and wife, and they don't have any children, the widow can get married to the brother. And to maintain, do you remember in Ruth, to maintain the name of the family, the child will continue the name of the father. So, Pedaiah is named here and here only. But when you read in Matthew and Luke's genealogy, you will read, he is the son of Shealtiel. Lots of stuff to clean up here, lots of loose ends. Now, if you want to know who Neri is, do you want to know who Neri is? Get on the telephone.